Welcome to Getting Personal with Plant Medicine. I'm your host, Diana Crash, and we are doing a special series right now about how to talk to your kids about certain aspects of plant medicine. And today I am joined by my special co-host.
Hi, I'm Maggie. I'm your co-host for this series.
So, one of the best things about being a plant medicine enthusiast is that I'm constantly learning how to enhance my life with something natural. For example, before I began using herbs and plants, my period was a nightmare. Now, being that I have endometriosis and ovarian cyst, it's never a breeze, but I'm able to manage my symptoms in a tolerable and sustainable way now.
And for me, my experience is very similar. I also have cysts on my ovaries, which resulted in some pretty painful cramps when I was younger. I knew I was about to start because I would get this extreme pain in my thigh, and I had no idea what it was. The doctors couldn't tell me what it was, but when I started to use more natural remedies and be very conscious of what I was putting into my body, it made it to where my cycles were not as painful.
I use CBD. I use a lot of things to help it to manage the symptoms. But red raspberry leaf tea, I know, is a superstar. As a lot of people are talking about it right now. It's a fantastic aid for PMS and for relieving cramps. CBD is also a great anti-inflammatory, and it can help with pain relief. So, what are some of the plant-based therapies that helped you manage, Maggie?
Absolutely used red raspberry leaf. It was definitely my go-to. And when I found out about it, it was definitely a lifesaver. Um, for me, it really did help with pain relief, but drinking lots of tea, red raspberry leaf tea, herba ursi tea, anything that helps with the urinary tract, like anything in that area.
Yeah, tea is a great way to incorporate healing herbs into your routine. I love tea. I can drink it all day. I do drink it all day. So, for a lot of us, despite the knowledge that we have about safer ways of managing symptoms, we struggle with how to talk to the children in our lives about menstruation. Pair that with plant medicine, and the conversation can seem daunting. However, the goal of this series is to find new ways of talking about it.
I agree. I've been down that road of talking about my moon time to my daughter, as I called it. She's like, "Why are you bleeding?" And, I definitely realize there are many ways, and there are lots of people looking for ways to talk to our children. That's why we are very excited to introduce our guest today, Leslie Draffin, because her work is all about getting comfortable with these conversations. How are you today, Leslie?
I am so good. Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk about these very taboo topics.
Mm-hmm.
So, Leslie, you coach young people to help them connect to their bodies and change their relationship to menstruation. When it comes to parents and caretakers, what advice do you have for starting a new kind of conversation with children?
I really feel like the most important thing about having these conversations with kids is open honesty and taking out any type of shame. And I think a lot of times that starts with you needing to address what you believe about your menstrual cycle yourself so that you can model that for the young people in your life. I think that's kind of where it would start. But I think talking about it, I love the phrase like moon time. I think that's really a beautiful way to reference the bleed, but also just letting them understand from a really young age that people with menstrual cycles ebb and flow. Sometimes we feel tired, sometimes we feel really energetic. If you have a male partner, and making those children understand that like sometimes dad feels differently than mom, and this might be a little bit why. And then also modeling for them respect for your body, listening to your body. And you could even do some, rituals around your cycle that might be special. Like, okay, mom really needs to just watch a movie tonight. Like, let's have a girls' movie night or a family movie night. Those would be things I would suggest as far as beginning to bring this conversation into your family at whatever stage you're in. And I also should, point out that, I'm not someone who has children, but I've worked with a lot of children. I have nieces in my life who are already, more aware of this. At 1 6.5, the 2.5-year-old isn't aware of it yet, but the 6.5-year-old really one is. And just being honest, like if they're asking questions because they see a tampon, like tell them what it is.
That's great. I almost think that kind of helps because you're not directly, like you don't have the shame or the fear that parents carry when they're talking. So you do coach and you teach young people about microdosing psilocybin. And, of course, we have to say as a disclosure, we're not advocating for children to do, psychedelics, but what are some ways that that children or people can microdose plant medicine that you would recommend for the younger people?
So I think just when we think about plants in general, you guys already hit the nail on the head, right? So red raspberry leaf is a great one for an herbal remedy to help with the menstrual cycle. But like you said, I have worked with teenagers to microdose psilocybin, and I have seen amazing results for those kids because what we know about psilocybin specifically is that it really helps to rewire our brain, to reprogram parts of our neural pathways. So, while you're growing and you're dealing with so much in high school, that can just be a beautiful teacher and a beautiful support when done in, addition to like actual coaching and guidance, right? Like with someone who's trained. But I think what's also really special is just the idea of communing with the spirit of medicine, communing with the spirit of mushrooms, understanding that Earth is our sacred mother and she is here to protect us. So there are many different ways that the things that grow on her could help us. Usually what I'll do before I, commit to working with a teenager is give them some journaling or give them some books to read or some Netflix. Like Netflix has a bunch of documentaries on this stuff, and have them just go out in nature and start to observe mushrooms in the wild. I'm not telling them to go pick and eat them by any means, but to start to understand, what it is that these mushrooms are. And I believe that they are sentient teachers here to help us live our best lives. And they want the best for us. And so we talk a lot about, the interconnectedness of the mycelium network and how, plants speak to each other through the mycelium network, and why when we ingest these medicines, it can also really help us as well. And so I developed something called cyclical microdosing, which is the only cycle-informed approach to microdosing psilocybin. And it really is a method that's broken down into two parts, the first half of your cycle and the second half of your cycle. And you would microdose on a slightly different schedule depending on where you are in your month. And what I've noticed is when we sit with medicine more often in the second half of the cycle where challenges often pop up, psilocybin can be a really beautiful helper to alleviate cramps, to alleviate mood swings for sure, and to help with things like focus, creativity all month long. And so I teach that to people of all ages. But again, I think that when we don't have these conversations with young people, that's how taboo starts, and that's how shame starts. And that's why they're more likely to go trip balls with no help at 14, 15 years old. Yeah. And so if they, from a very young age, understand, like, this is what an entheogen is. It helps us to connect with our divine within. This is what a plant medicine is. This is what a psychedelic is to help you connect with your mind, body, soul. I think they'll have more respect overall. And so one day when they choose to, take mushrooms or whatever plant medicine or psychedelic they choose to consume, hopefully they'll have a little less shame around it, but be able to do it in a safer way, because that's truly my thing. It's like, let's have these conversations so you don't have shame and so that you are safer. Absolutely. And I think that also goes for menstruation too, right? Because if we could just have actual open conversations about menstruation, we would not have the problems with teenage birth rate.
Right. And I mean, also to your point about safety, I mean, I'm thinking back to when I was in school and being a teenager with horrific periods, and I was given Tylenol 3 and, Midol and all of these things that
800 milligrams of ibuprofen.
Birth control, just go on birth control.
Right. Yeah. And it completely disconnects you from your body and among many other things. And so, to that point a little bit, how would you explain awakening your feminine flow to someone who just began menstruating?
I think that people, like young people nowadays, I've met more than I have met. So I've met more who are afraid of their cycle than I've met that are actually empowered by it. And my hope is that we get more and more people who are empowered by their cycles. But I think that, putting myself in the shoes of my little Leslie, who was 11 when her bleed started and I was terrified, I don't think you could have really at that stage for me and my rate, like the way I was raised, like I would not have had a clue what you meant by feminine flow because I was raised with a very patriarchal mother and in a system in the early 2000s that was and it is still fucked up, but like y'all know, like it was real messed up. So I think now if I could go back and either re-explain it to myself, I would have started a lot earlier, right? It's like if you like, I just think starting early is so essential. And so that's one thing. If you haven't started early, and let's say that you're someone who is just starting menstruation and you're freaked out, I think the first thing you can start to understand is that this is a supremely natural part of life. Menstruation actually gets like a weird rep as like not a natural thing or like a thing that's wrong. And it's absolutely not wrong whatsoever. And when you start to understand that you have these changing hormones, you have different seasons within your cycle, that explains why you feel really weird at certain times, why you've got weird things happening in your underwear at other times. You'll just start to feel less weird, for one thing. And God, we all know as middle schoolers, like we felt real fucking weird, most of us. And then just allowing them to experience this in a way that feels happy and joyful. Like I know some folks think that those cliche, like they think those period parties are cliche, but I think they're fucking rad as hell. And so throw a period party. And even if your child had their menstrual cycle like years ago, you can always come back and do your own like red tent, making it something special, making them understand that this is a part of you stepping into your feminine womanhood, or your, AFAB body if you're someone who's non-binary but you still bleed, and that is something that you can celebrate and feel really joyful about. And when you have the education behind that as well as the empowerment aspect, I think that's when you can really awaken the feminine flow.
I agree. I love that. And I love that you mentioned the red tent because that's like a cultural type of, a cultural, like you go to a quinceañera, but like the younger children would go to the red tent and see how this rite of passage was done so that they knew when it was their time, they weren't afraid. Yeah. So based on that, what are some actionable ways that parents and caregivers can help remove that shame and help with that discussion that you just talked about bleeding?
Yeah. Again, I think that the first step is to do your own inner work around what you believe about your blood, what you believe about your period. That's always the very first thing I have clients do is what stories were you told about the menstrual cycle? What do you believe about the menstrual cycle yourself? Do you think that it's gross? Will you look at your blood? Have you touched your blood? I'm a womb witch. Like I do blood magic. I've tasted my blood. Like, and we're not saying you got to go that far deep into the woo, but it's like, what do you really think about it? Because even if you want to be the most unbiased, empowering person, if you subconsciously still have these beliefs around the cycle as embarrassing or disgusting or nasty, that's going to come forward. Your kids are going to pick up on that. Like they are. And I think that's one reason why psilocybin is really helpful for this work, because it allows you to get underneath those limiting beliefs or just those roots that are often really deep in our psyche around what it is to bleed and be a bleeding person. And so that would be the first thing. I think the second thing is to make it special. And like we said, the red tent is such a beautiful, beautiful thing that I learned about years ago. And I just crave it myself. I crave being in community with other people bleeding. And it's and it's not what our society is set up for now. And so can you go take them to a women's circle? Can you, with the women in your family, create something and allow those young premenstrual people or young menstruators to see that not only is this something that is not gross, but it is something that is fucking divine and it's special. And then I think the last thing, just a really actionable way, is just to start like, where are your period products? Are you hiding them or are they on the counter? If they're underneath the sink, put them on the counter, put them in like a special display. You want kids to be familiar with what they're going to be possibly using and be able to ask you questions. And then I also think the other thing that I'm really big on is let's start calling our anatomy what the actual fucking words are. Like, let's use the correct words. Let's use the word vulva. Let's use the word vagina. And they're different. They are different. So we need to have that clear. And that's important, right? Especially when we're talking about menstrual cycles, right? Like, where would you put the tampon? You're going to put it in the vaginal canal. And if you call your entire genitals vagina, like, stuff just gets a little confusing. And so calling things what they really are, allowing kids to play with art, like making art, showing them what they're like, the drawings of the uterus, and allowing them to just know, what is this? And this is how babies are made. Like, I know we're not really talking about sex education, but it's like, the more we speak about these things with the right terms versus down there and no and private parts, like, one, the less likely your kids are to get groomed. But secondly, the more empowered they're going to be, and they're going to be more empowered bleeders. They're going to be more empowered sexual beings when they grow up. They're going to be much more likely to have a good knowledge around consent. And so I think that those are all some actionable ways that you can go. Like, if you want to have a red tint, great. If you just want to put your period products out and start calling their genitals the right terms, then those are both excellent places to start.
I couldn't agree more. And one of my favorite things is hearing my 5-year-old son say vagina and vulva. Like, he has, one of those books, and it's the cutest thing ever. But, for someone who has sons or people who have children who aren't AFAB, but want to teach them about honoring their feminine body, because as you say on your website, it's not everyone has a feminine body, and everyone should be connecting to their femininity. So how can parents who struggle with their own femininity help their children honor that feminine body?
Such a good question. So I have been someone for my entire life who lived mostly in her masculine, believe it or not. And I think it's really interesting to understand that, like you were just saying, we both have masculine and feminine energies within ourselves. And so I think that's one reason why it's important for everyone to understand those different flows of energy. But I think for people who, are women or identify as women who are AFAB and they feel detached from their femininity, but want to help their children who may be children who are girls or children who are AFAB connect with that part of themselves, I think, again, it's one of those things where we start to go slower. We start to honor the rhythm of nature. We start to understand that this modern Western world was not set up for female hormones. We very much honor the male hormone cycle, which is very static day after day. It's like the sun, rises and falls pretty predictably. Whereas people in female bodies really align more closely with the moon's phases. So can you do some moon gazing? Can you just honor the 4 seasons of the year and understand that in winter we're fallow and that's when we rest? And that's why when we have that death cycle, we can pop into spring, because you can't go from fall to spring without the part where we rest. And so I think that's another way that people can begin to honor not only their own femininity and their feminine energy, but to show kids that we don't have to be hustling. We don't have to be busy and striving all of the time. And in fact, when we do that, that's when things happen like burnout. That's when things happen like insane stress. It's when the planet starts to burn. So those would be my suggestions, is to slow down and start to honor the seasons, look at the moon, not only for yourself to help boost your own feminine connection, but again, to help anyone in your life who you want to be able to honor theirs as they grow.
When I was in 5th grade and they came to talk to us about our periods, if one person would have just made that connection to the moon and the cycles of the moon, I would have had
I get chills every time
I would have had a
completely
different experience.
Seriously.
It would have been completely different.
Yep.
I probably wouldn't have had some adrenal fatigue.
100% right.
Right.
James.
And with that, what is one thing that you wish you could change about the menstruation health education that we do have? I know my son doesn't. I don't think his middle school does sex education anything like that. Or
You know what? I
Yeah.
think you just said it. Why is menstruation connected to sex health? Why the fuck are those two things together? So we saw in the last 18 months some really terrible things happen. I'm thinking of you, Florida, where not only did they loop it all together, but they said that you could not speak about this whatsoever. And I'm talking about menstrual health before 6th grade. Do you know how many children I've worked with who have their bleed before 6th grade?
Mm-hmm.
Me.
Mm-hmm.
It was me.
Yeah.
I mean, my sister-in-law had her bleed, I think she said at like age 8. So it's
Yeah.
like this is happening earlier and earlier. And so when there's a couple of phases to this. You only asked for one, but let's just go with it. When we loop menstrual health with sex education, it says something. It says that this means this is what this is, right?
Mm-hmm.
And because of the way that our very Christian-based society looks at sex, what else does that say? That this is shameful. This is
Mm-hmm.
wrong. This is something you only talk about in hushed little silences when you're of a certain age. That's the
Mm-hmm.
fucking problem. And
Mm-hmm.
so we need to be talking about menstrual health the second we're talking about the biology of your body. Hands, feet, great. We're talking about nose, ears, throat. Where's your vulva? Okay. And when you're in little kids,
I love that.
like little children can learn this stuff and and they're not going to have the taboo around it unless you put it on them.
Exactly.
Right. And so that they absorb so much. And so that would be the first thing I would say is we've got to separate it. We have to start understanding that half of the population bleeds and you're really doing a massive disservice to them by making them wait to some age, some arbitrary age, because middle schoolers are not like suddenly mature enough to talk about this. They're like terribly immature, and that's fine. Like seriously, I can have a better conversation with my 6.5-year-old niece than I could with like a 12-year-old.
Mm-hmm.
Because something happens, right? And and you know what happens is our own biases, our own shame.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd say you've got to start separating menstrual health from sex education. And then the other thing, oh God, I get so fucking fired up about this. And the other thing is we have to start educating ourselves, because I understand there's all of this, there's this back and forth between, and that's one of the reasons why I live in a state where there's just abstinence-based education. And I don't really know what they're teaching kids about menstrual cycles. That's why I talk to kids in Texas about what's happening with their bodies. But we, as the people who are seeing our children from the time that they're born until the time that, they go on, we have to have the ability to talk about this too. And so we have to educate ourselves. Yes, we send children to school so that they become educated, but if that's the only conversation they're having about this, that's not good enough. We have to model it in the home. We have to model it within ourselves, because so often what they're going to get from school is going to be very clinical. They're not going to hear about the inner seasons of their cycle. They're not going to hear about how they are the moon and those without bleeds are the sun. And they're going to start to think something's wrong with them. And they just are, because that's what abstinence-based sex education makes people feel who have vulvas. That's what menstrual cycle education makes people feel, because again, they're going to pick up on that subconscious. And so doing the work, you're empowered to do your own work, and you're empowered to educate yourself, and to just do a little better, right? Like, I'm not saying you have to go out and read every single book and get like an education's worth of like cycle health. Just do 1% better. Just leave the tampons out. Just don't hide the fact that you need to go buy tampons. If you've got cramps, tell them. If you want chocolate, be like, it's mommy's bleed. Like, I want to just like veg out on the couch with you and hang out. Or I need to take a bath. Can you do your own thing for 20 minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those are all really great tips. I have learned so much today, and this was such a great conversation. And we appreciate you coming on and talking about this challenging topic, Leslie. So how can people find you and support you?
Well, if you are someone who does want to find more about cyclical living, I have a wonderful course that you can grab. It's called Cycle Codes. It is a beginner's guide to cyclical living that'll take you pretty much from A to Z. This is everything I wish I'd known when I started my own cyclical journey. And it includes how to work out for your cycle, what to eat for your cycle. And you can find that on my website or my Instagram, and that's $97. You can also get on my email list, where we talk a lot about psilocybin and microdosing and a little bit less about the menstrual cycle. But if you are someone who wants to learn more and has questions, you can always book a free one-on-one call with me. They can give the links to put in the show notes, because again, I really believe I was put here on this planet to help people feel more at home in their bodies. And I do that through pleasure education and menstrual cycle education and helping people use psilocybin and psychedelics intentionally. And so if that's something that really you feel called to, then let's chat.
Thank you so much, Leslie. This episode was produced by Your Highness Media, audio editing done by James Crash, and sponsored by mitragaya.com. Be sure to subscribe and rate our podcast if you haven't yet. And subscribe to our Your Highness Media newsletter on Substack for everything new going on in the Your Highness Media world.